Well, hello and how are you? Hey friends, it's me again, Shenandoah Briscoe, coming to you live right here in St. Charles, Missouri. Yes, sir, our next main event is down on Main Street within the 100 block of North Main. That's right, North Main Street. Yes, sir, we're going to have an ice carving competition January 30th. That'll be not this Saturday coming up, but the following Saturday. And this means that they're going to be taking big old hunks of ice and carving them into beautiful statuettes of different things. Like I've seen Harley Davidson motorcycles, I've seen angels, I've seen eagles, all kinds of things carved out of ice. So come on down and enjoy yourself on North Main Street in St. Charles, within the 100 block and 200 block of North Main. Alrighty, well alrighty then. That being said, this here is going to be blog number 343. That's right, 343. Well, let's get right back into our story. To Build a Fire by Jack London. Well, at 12 o'clock the day was at its brightest, yet the sun was so far south on its winter journey to clear the horizon. The bulge of the earth intervened between it and Henderson Creek, where the man walked under a clear sky at noon and cast no shadow. At 12:30 to the minute, he arrived at the forks of the creek. He was pleased at the speed he had made. If he kept it up, he would certainly be with the boys by 6. He unbuttoned his jacket and shirt and drew forth his lunch. The action consumed no more than a quarter of a minute, yet that brief moment the numbness had laid hold of his exposed fingers. He did not put the mitten on, but instead struck his fingers a dozen sharp smashes against his leg. Then he sat down on a snow-covered log to eat. The stinging that followed upon the striking of his fingers against his legs ceased so quickly that he was startled. He had no chance to take a bite of his biscuits. He struck the fingers repeatedly and returned them into the mitten. Burying the other hand for a purpose of eating, he tried to take a mouthful, but the ice muzzle prevented it. He had forgotten to build a fire and thaw out. He chuckled at his foolishness, and as he chuckled, he noted the numbness creeping into the exposed fingers. Also, he noted that the stinging, which had first come to his toes when he sat down, was already passing away. He wondered whether the toes were warm or numb. He moved them inside the moccasins and decided that they were numb. He pulled the mitten on hurriedly and stood up. He was a bit frightened. He stamped up and down until the stinging returned to the feet. It certainly was cold, was his thought. The man from Sulphur Creek had spoken the truth when telling how cold it sometimes got in the country, and he had laughed at him at the time. That shadowed one moment, not too sure of things. That showed one must not be too sure of things. There was no mistake about it. It was cold. He stood up and down, stamping his feet and thrashing his arms until reassured by the returning warmth. Then he got out matches and proceeded to make a fire. From the undergrowth where the high waters of the previous spring had lodged a supply of seasoned twigs, he got his firewood. Working carefully from a small beginning, he soon had a roaring fire over which he thawed the ice from his face, and in the protection of which he ate his biscuits. For the moment, the cold of space was outwitted. The dog took satisfaction in the fire, stretching out close enough for warmth and far enough away to escape being singed. When the man had finished, he filled his pipe and took his comfortable time over a smoke. Then he pulled on his mittens, settled the ear flaps of his cap firmly about his ears, and took the creek trail up to the left fork. The dog was disappointed and yearned back towards the fire. The man did not know cold. Possibly all the generations of his ancestries had been ignorant of cold, of real cold, of cold 107 degrees below freezing point. But the dog knew, all its ancestries knew, and it had inherited knowledge, and it knew that it was cold, not good to walk abroad in such fearful cold. It was the time to lie snug in a hole in the snow and wait for a curtain of cold to be drawn across the face of outer space, whence the cold came. On the other hand, there was keen intimacy between the dog and the man. The one was the toil slave of the other, and the only curses it had ever received when the curses of the whip lash and the harsh and menacing throat sounds that threatened the whiplash. So the dog made no effort to communicate its apprehension to the man. It was not concerned in the welfare of the man. It was for its own sake that it had yearned back towards the fire. But the man whistled and spoke to it with the sounds of a whiplash, and the dog swung in at the man's heels and followed after. The man took a chaw of tobacco and proceeded to start a new amber beard. Also, his moist breath quickly powdered the whites of his mustache, eyebrows, and lashes. There did not seem to be so many springs at the left fork of the Henderson, and for a half hour the man saw no signs of any. And then it happened. At a place where there was no sign, where the soft, unbroken snow seemed to advertise solidity beneath it, the man broke through. It was not deep. He wetted himself halfway to the knees before he floundered out to the firm crust. He was angry and cursed his luck aloud. He had hoped to get to the camp by 6 o'clock, and this would delay him an hour, for he would have to build a fire and dry out his footgear. This was imperative at the low temperatures. He knew that much, and he turned aside to the bank, where he climbed on top. Tangled in the underbrush about the trunks of several small spruce trees was a high water deposit of dry firewood, sticks and twigs principally, but also longer portions of seasoned branches and fine dry last year's grasses. He threw down several large pieces on top of the snow. This served for a foundation and prevented the young flame from drawing itself in the snow. It otherwise would melt. The flames he got by touching a match to a small shred of birch bark that he took from his pocket. This burned even more readily than paper. Placing it on the foundation, he fed the young flames with wisps of dry grass and within the tiniest dry twigs. He worked slowly and carefully, keenly aware of his danger. Gradually, as the flames grew stronger, he increased the size and twigs which he fed it. He squatted in the snow, pulling the twigs out from their entanglement in the brush and feeding directly to the flame. He knew there must be no failure. When it is 75 below zero, a man must not fail in his first attempt to build a fire. That is, if his feet are wet. If his feet are wet. If his feet are dry and he fails, he can run along the trail for a half a mile and restore its circulation. But with wet feet will freeze the harder. At this time, the man knew. The old-timer on Sculpture Creek had told him about the previous fall, and now he was appreciating the advice. Already all sensation had gone out of his feet. To build the fire, he had been forced to remove his mittens, and the fingers had quickly gone numb. His pace of 4 miles an hour had kept his heart pumping blood to the surface of his body and to all the extremities. But the instant he stopped, the action of the pump eased down. The cold of the space smote the unprotected tips of the planet, and him being on the unprotected tip, receiving the full force of the blow. The blood of his body recoiled before it, and the blood was alive. Like the dog, it wanted to hide away and cover itself up from the fearful cold. So long as he walked 4 miles an hour, he pumped that blood willy-nilly to the surface. But now it embedded away and sank down into the recesses of his body. The extremities were the first to feel its absence. His wet feet froze the faster, and his exposed fingers numbed the faster, though they had not yet begun to freeze. Nose and cheeks were already freezing, while the skin of all his body chilled as it lost its blood. But he was safe. Toes and nose and cheek would be only touched by the frost, for the fire was beginning to burn with strength. He was feeding it with twigs the size of his fingers. In another minute he would be able to feed it with branches the size of his wrist, and then he could remove his wet footgear, and while it dried, he could keep his naked feet warm by the fire, rubbing them at first, of course, with snow. The fire was a success. He was safe. He remembered the advice of the old-timer on Sculpture Creek and smiled. The old-timer had been very serious in laying down the law that no man must travel alone in the Klondike after 50 below. Well, here he was. He had the accident. He was alone, and he had saved himself. Those old-timers were rather womanish. Some of them, he thought. All a man had to do was to keep his head, and he was all right. Any man who was a man could travel alone, but it was surprising the rapidity was which his cheeks and nose were freezing, and he had not thought his fingers could go lifeless in so short a time. Lifeless they were, for he could scarcely make them move together to grip a twig, and they seemed remote from his body and from him. When he touched a twig, he had to look and see whether or not he had hold of it. The wires were pretty well down between him and his finger ends, all of which counted for little. There was the fire, snapping and cracking and promising life with every dancing flame. He started to untie his moccasins. They were coated with ice. The thick German socks were like sheaths of iron halfway to the knee, and the moccasin strings were like rods of steel, all twisted and knotted as by some conflagration. For a moment he tugged with his numbed fingers, then realizing the folly of it, he drew his sheath knife. But before he could cut the strings, it happened. It was his own fault, or rather his mistake. He should never have built the fire under the spruce tree. He should have built it in the open, but it had been easier to pull the twigs from the brush and drop them directly onto the fire. Now the tree under which he had done this carried a weight of snow on its boughs. Now, no wind had blown for weeks, and each bough was fully freighted. Each time he had pulled the twig, he had communicated a slight agitation to the tree, as implicable agitation so far as he was concerned, but an agitation significant to bring about the disaster. High up in the tree, one bough collapsed its load of snow. This fell on the boughs beneath, capsizing them. This process continued, spreading out and involving the whole tree. It grew like an avalanche, and it descended without warning upon the man and the fire was blotted out. Where it had burned was a mantle of fresh and disordered snow. The man was shocked. It was as though he had just heard his own sentence of death. For a moment he sat and stared at the spot where the fire had been. Well, hey, that's my time, long time ago. Anyway, this is Shenandoah Briscoe saying hello and how are you? You know, God loves you, and so do I. So be blessed and have a great day. Come back and see me tomorrow because, well, I'll be here and I hope you are too.